Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. New Yorkers have just a few more hours left to cast their ballots in the state's primaries. We're tracking all the results throughout the day and night, and we have the latest data from our exit polls coming up. Here with me tonight to talk about all that and much more are CBSN political contributor and former John McCain campaign manager Rick Davis, CBSN political contributor and founding partner of 270 Strategies, Linda Tran. We do want to disclose that several employees at 270 Strategies do some work for the Hillary Clinton campaign, but Linda herself does not. We also have Real Clear Politics reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns and CBS News senior political editor Steve Chigueras. Thank you all for being here. Before we get to talking, I do want to point out what's going on at the bottom of your screen. There we'll be showing you continuously updated results from tonight's primary, so you want to keep an eye on that. Now, let's start off with our exit polls. What else? Look at the Democratic side here. New York Democratic voters were asked, what is the most important issue to them? And you see there 35% saying the economy, jobs, 20% health care, 14% terrorism, 28% income inequality. Linda, let me start with you. What do you make of those numbers?
So the top three look a lot like what we've seen in election after election this primary cycle, but that last number, if I'm not mistaken, looks a little high on income inequality, and that's probably a good sign for Bernie, or at least it means that some of his folks are really turning out today.
Yeah, and let me turn to you, Caitlin. When you see those figures, what comes to mind here? Because Bernie Sanders, as Linda points out, has been hitting that theme of income inequality, but here in New York, sometimes those feelings about Wall Street can be a little bit more complicated because folks have connections to that community.
Exactly, and that's the line that Hillary Clinton has been trying to tread pretty carefully throughout this campaign, but she has really embraced this idea of Wall Street reform and that kind of thing. So it is a very different election campaign here because it is in the shadow of Wall Street, and it's been a very much a fixture of the campaign as a whole, but especially here in New York. And Sanders has gathered massive crowds in New York. We saw him in Washington Square Park, in Prospect Park, in Brooklyn, and so that's really been a theme that he's hitting hard with that literal backdrop of downtown New York.
Rick, let me ask you, during debates, during campaign stops, we've heard Bernie Sanders hit Hillary Clinton over this issue of ties to Wall Street. Yep. He talked about, why don't you release your transcripts of your paid speeches to Goldman Sachs? This is something that we've heard from him time and time again. What do you think about that? And you look at those numbers and you see the importance there for Democratic voters on that issue of the economy taking the top spot there, followed by income inequality. Is that potentially a vulnerability for Hillary Clinton, the issue of Wall Street ties?
Well, Wall Street is part of the economy of New York City. So the question is, how much does this city turn out for Hillary in defense of their jobs in the economy? Because that is a major factor here for taxes and spending in the city of New York. I'd say even Hillary is attacking Wall Street, right? So when you look at what Bernie is doing against Hillary, and then Hillary sort of passes that pain along to Wall Street, where she has taken up so many of Bernie Sanders' campaign themes. I mean, they've sort of morphed into the same person. It's like watching Saturday Night Live all day long. And so I think that it's hard to tell who's really hurt anymore because they've become to mimic the same campaign themes. And Bernie will hit her on Wall Street in the speeches, which I think is a really legitimate political issue that she hasn't divulged what she says behind closed doors to these big money organizations. Yet she then goes right after them, too, on income inequality and pay and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out tonight, especially in the demographic of Manhattan.
Steve, you want to weigh in?
Well, I want to point out that there is an exit poll question on what is Wall Street's impact on the economy, right? And so you look at the Democratic side, 64% of Democrats said it hurts the economy.
It's pretty overwhelming.
And on the Republican side, 51% say it hurts the economy. So even though New York City, Wall Street, you'd expect maybe on the Republican side it would be less than a majority, but it isn't. And so it's sort of low-hanging fruit for both Sanders and Clinton to rail on Wall Street because it seems as if that's an issue this year that's resonating with voters.
And what about, oh, go ahead, Rick.
I was just going to say, I'm not surprised by the Republican numbers because that's an upstate vote and they don't get benefit from the tax base here. What'll be interesting to see is what that Manhattan demographic looks like. I mean, I think this is really an upstate story tonight. And I think Hillary's strength in the upstate is probably what's going to drive a lot of her numbers in the outcome of today's election. But it will be interesting to see if there's a big difference between how Manhattan and the boroughs vote versus how upstate New York looks at things.
Yeah. Linda, let me ask you, what do you think about just the Hillary Clinton's ability to energize voters. We've seen her out on the campaign trail. We've seen her reaching out to various communities. How do you think that she has been sort of changing things up with Bernie Sanders' continued presence in the campaign here? She's really fighting for every vote.
Yeah, I think actually you've seen a transition in her since she arrived back in New York. It's very clear that this is a place where she was twice elected senator. She's very, very comfortable, whether it's, shooting dominoes in Harlem or drinking bubble tea, up in Queens. And, you're seeing her try to play to her strengths. So she's in these intimate environments. She's very clearly setting up events that allow her to interact one-on-one, knowing that that is going to be contrasted with Bernie Sanders and his 27,000 person, rally at Prospect Park. They're setting up two different pictures for voters to see. And I think that she's also really leaning into talking about local issues in a way that only somebody who's been a senator from New York is able to do.
Let's take a look at these numbers here that we're looking at now. Most important quality for New York Democratic voters. You see experience, 32%, honest and trustworthiness, 29% cares about people like me, 25% can win in November, 11%. Caitlin, let me ask you, the honest and trustworthy factor is something that we have talked about as a vulnerability for Hillary Clinton before. What do you make of these figures?
A large vulnerability, and we talked about the mileage that Bernie Sanders has been getting off these Wall Street attacks as it pertains to Hillary Clinton. I also think this is a big part of it, going after her for talking about how she wants to reform Wall Street, but also at the same time taking money from some of these companies that she's given speeches to. So I think that has resonated with Democratic voters or independents who are supporting someone like Sanders. The interesting thing, though, about this primary that we know is that it's closed, right? So only Democrats, registered Democrats, can vote here. So this is really speaking, these numbers that we're seeing across the board are really speaking to the Democratic Party, not just kind of the coalition that Sanders has built. So that's telling for kind of the fall campaign as well.
And Steve, that's something that we've heard out of the Sanders campaign is the fact that because of the closed system here, that you're not going to have those independents who are going to be able to come out, people that Bernie Sanders has said he appeals to. What do you make, though, of these figures? When you look at experience and honest and trustworthiness, those are the two top qualities that New York Democratic voters are looking for. Who do you think that bodes well for? Who do you think that could possibly be difficulty for?
Well, you would figure the Clinton folks would be happy to see experience on top. I mean, that's really been her argument from the very beginning. 32%. I'm not sure we've seen that at the top. Usually it's the honesty and trustworthy numbers and the cares about people like me number that does a little bit better than experience. And so the fact that that's on top, that's they're probably looking at that as a good sign for her.
I would just say, why doesn't anybody want to win this election?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. It's funny you say that.
So
because
Democrats at 11 and Republicans at 8 care about who's best to win in November.
Why?
Because I think that this election has been all about making a point and not about the outcome. I mean, you're in a one-on-one race, basically, for both campaigns, and it still hasn't turned to who's best able to win the White House. And you keep waiting for that week after week, primary after primary. These have been incredibly, historically low numbers, and yet these are as low as any state we've seen all season. So 8% Republicans say they care about winning in November, and the balance are all about who cares about me and experience and being different about change. I think you're right, Steve. I think that the big number there is what's on top, and that is experience. And that's what we're going to see play out, I think, here in New York. Hillary Clinton was a very successful senator for New York. And I think if there's one thing that brings her value to this race in New York is that experience. She delivered for New York, and I think voters remember that.
I want to look at another number here. Who has run a more unfair campaign? And that number has Hillary Clinton at 49%, Bernie Sanders at 32%. It's interesting because, Linda, we were talking about this during the Democratic debate, just how sharp these attacks between these two candidates have gotten, and how we saw that really from the get-go during that Democratic debate in Brooklyn, how really there were no punches pulled between these two.
Yeah, that's totally true. And actually, my favorite moment all campaign season so far has been a tweet from John Dingell during that debate where he said, "This old angry shouting guy is tired of hearing from the old angry shouting guy." It was just hysterical, right. But sort of encapsulated the debate, in one fell swoop. Look, I think that both of them have turned to a much more sharp tone, especially in the last 2 weeks. That's not something that you can miss if you're paying attention at all to this, and I think people are responding to that.
She gets the knock, though. 49% think that she ran the more unfair campaign. Bernie Sanders only got 32%. Why do you think that is?
I think that comes back back to what we've said before, which is people know Hillary Clinton, and sometimes that's a good thing. They remember that she delivered for New York, and sometimes that's a terrible thing. They remember the last 25 years of whatever opinions they have formed about her. And so if you already have a bad opinion about her and you see this dynamic of people kind of butting heads, you're probably thinking it's her fault.
You want to weigh
An
in,
interesting
Caitlin?
thing that this campaign has done is it's put such a big spotlight on the rules and the process of the campaign. And so voters, Sanders, to his credit, says he's bringing in new voters. Donald Trump says he's bringing in new voters as well. They're looking at these rules and saying, what are super delegates? Why are they all for Hillary Clinton? Why, if he's winning states, is she leading in the delegate count? And so these are legitimate questions that voters are asking, and I think that can translate to some of these answers that we're seeing.
All right, let's turn to the Republicans here. Most important issue for Republican voters in the state of New York, the economy, 35%. So this is most important. Okay, we're going to go. There we go. So the economy and jobs, 37%. Terrorism, 27%. Government spending, 24%. Immigration, 8%. Rick, what do you make of those?
Well, you can tell the people in New York are deathly afraid of immigration. They care almost about as much about that as winning in November. So, I mean, well done, New Yorkers. What I think is really interesting about these numbers is the really huge amount of interest in economy, jobs, and government spending. I mean, when you combine those two, you know, you're basically talking about the economic factors that weigh on people when they make a decision. And that's well over 60%, 61%. So when you have 61% of the electorate saying, I care about government spending and the economy, you can guarantee that that's the driver. We've seen terrorism as number two, but and it's sort of comfortably there in almost every state we've seen recently because of all, I think, the global occurrences of terror. But you can't ignore the really amazing, huge number, 61%. That are economic-related concerns that voters have in New York.
So how does New York look then? I mean, when Donald Trump was out, I think, in Buffalo yesterday, he was basically making his pitch using the very specific economic data of that general area and talking about unemployment and how the area has suffered. We've talked about this in other states before, where an appeal to particularly blue-collar Republican voters has been such a strength for Donald Trump.
Yeah, and he's refined his message to actually include hard data now, right? So rather than just being out there and being sort of bombastic and driving a message based on how many news outlets will write or report what he says that day because it's such a newsworthy thing. He's filling in some of the blanks. His campaign's maturing a little bit. They're getting more data into his speeches. And look, for New York, it's a local race for him. And he does have a reputation for creating jobs and economic activity. He's not an insider. He doesn't believe in government spending. You know, he thinks they ought to get out of your business. And so he sort of fits really neatly into the New York demographic, right? What he thinks and does as a New Yorker is what a lot of New Yorkers, especially Republicans, think and do.
Do you want to weigh in, Steve?
I was just going to say, if you looked at the polls coming into tonight and how overwhelmingly ahead Trump was coming in, it's not a surprise to see these issues at the top. It's also not a surprise to see that on the question of outside politics or political experience, that 64% of Republicans today say they want somebody to be outside of politics. And so, again, probably bodes well for Trump, or at least reflects what we've seen leading up to today, that this really, these answers really are sort of tailor-made for Trump.
Yeah. Let's look at most important quality here. Among Republican voters in New York, they were asked that question. The top quality was can bring change. Can bring change. 35% of Republican voters saying that's the most important quality. Shares my values, 28%. Tells it like it is, 28%. And there's Rick's favorite, can win in November, 8%.
Stragglers.
So, okay, can bring change. Seems tailor-made for Donald Trump.
Tailor-made for Donald Trump. We see states that he does well in. These are big numbers. This is a big number by any stretch of the imagination. For the Republicans, it is a change election, right? We don't want any more Barack Obama. And so who's the most likely person to give us something other than that? It's significantly different than the Democratic campaign where, frankly, there's a lot of good feeling about Barack Obama and they want to sustain some of the programs. So this is where the race turns black and white, Democrat versus Republican, and the attitudes about what the future holds.
You know, I just want to ask you, Rick, you know, shares values, that's 28%. And I know it's different for every state and in every region, really, in different states. But is there something that you can point to that you've been able to kind of get your finger on the pulse of now? Because this issue of values, you and I have talked about this before many, many times. The idea that Donald Trump has an appeal that cuts across demographic groups, that moderates, conservatives, there is a swath of people there that in past years you may not have thought would have been Donald Trump supporters, but now are clearly part of his base. When we talk about shares my values, is the Republican Party closer to knowing what those values specifically are?
I do think New York's election today may be slightly different than any other because we've been debating New York values since the start of this election.
No, that's why I asked.
And now you actually get to vote on what you think New York values are. I think the point you make, where he has a broad-based appeal, is different than what happens just in New York. And I think his broad-based appeal is focused on the frustration that so many voters feel that they've been left out of the economic improvement that the country has gone through, that there is a lack of interest in their issues and their frustrations, that Washington isn't doing anything for them. And they've had it, right? I've simply given up on the idea that there's going to be any kind of rescue package for them or there's any comedy with Washington where they feel like they're going to be advantaged. And so Donald Trump comes along and says, you know what? I feel the same way you do. Now, he's a billionaire from Manhattan, but he is appealing to lower income, lower education, whites in rural areas of the country, and there are a lot of those in New York. And they like what they hear from Donald Trump.
And in fact, here are the angry and dissatisfied numbers, Caitlin. Sorry, 36% of Republican voters in New York are angry. When it comes to federal government, 47% saying they're dissatisfied. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Sure. Well, this is exactly right. And also, some of the differences with the Republican Party, the frustration, a lot of it is with the Republican Party. You talk to voters and they feel disaffected, not only in terms of the economy, but also in terms of what the party is doing for them. You talk to people at Trump rallies all the time who say, I've voted for Republicans for a long time, and the things they've promised they haven't been able to deliver. And I think that's why Trump's latest message, kind of railing against the RNC, railing against the system, the delegate system, kind of putting this, they're not listening to you, you're voting and they're not listening kind of thing. I think he's getting a lot of traction out of it because it's all part of the same kind of thing he's been talking about and what voters have been registering in these polls.
Yeah.
You know what's funny is the words that you use matter. We know this. It's why we poll, right? And ironically, both Bernie and Donald Trump have been talking a lot about how the system is rigged. And that word, rigged, I think, is really resonating with people who feel like, the deck is stacked against them on a daily basis.
Trump has also been using the word crooked a lot recently, too. No, I mean, it fits in.
In relation to his own party.
Well, right. But I mean, it fits in. Fits in with this argument of this, everything's stacked against you, and I'm going to be the one to clean it up.
Exactly.
I think one of the things that's interesting is the fact that Cruz hasn't been able to capitalize on this. I mean, he was the anti-Washington senator, right? He shut down government with all kinds of protests. He's railed against his own party as being not devoted enough to conservative principles. He's the least liked man on Capitol Hill for all this reason, and he gets very little credit with the voters for it.
But I wonder if it's because of this specific campaign, he is now aligning himself with the establishment in a sense in order to get the nomination, right? And I wonder if some voters are seeing that or not.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between the messaging, which is very anti-establishment, versus the tactics. And I don't think these tactics get most people paying much attention to it. In fact, most people don't pay much attention.
We pay a lot of attention, but yeah, we do. Right.
Yeah.
Although I think
we are obsessed.
But I do think that Trump is shining a light on this process a little bit more now, because and when these questions are asked, and it was asked in the exit poll, if the candidate, if there's no delegate majority, who should be the nominee? 72% of the candidate with most votes should be the nominee, right? And that plays right into the argument of Trump saying, hey, I might not get there in terms of getting a majority of the delegates, but I'm going to win on all the factors, whether it's more delegates, more popular vote, more states won.
Right, isn't that fair?
Let me be the nominee, right? Otherwise, it's rigged.
Right. That's his
Right, and
argument.
it's also coming at a stage in this cycle where the rest of it has already happened. And so what Caitlin was saying earlier, if you're a voter sitting at home and you see this person's winning and they have, a certain number of votes going their way, and then all of a sudden you're hearing about, no, they're going to snatch it from him, it makes sense. If he starts talking about it being rigged now, it resonates with people.
And you talk to Trump supporters, and they frame it as Ted Cruz is stealing delegates. That's what they say.
Right.
Even though he's playing by the very rules that are there, he's doing well. He's run a very good campaign in terms of hunting those delegates.
But there's something illegitimate about the way in which he's going
which
about
is
it.
That's
fascinating.
That's the
to
PR
you.
challenge that Cruz and the RNC has
Right.
moving forward.
Well, and who's better at creating a PR challenge than Donald Trump?
Right.
Exactly.